Hi, I'm Paul Bloom. I'm a professor of psychology at Yale University. What I want to do today is talk about the field of psychology, the science of the human mind. Now, I'm admittedly biased, but I think psychology is the most interesting of all fields. It's the most interesting because it's about us. It's about the most important and intimate aspects of our lives. It's about language and perception. It's about our memory of things. It's about our dreams, love, hate. It's about morality, our sense of right and wrong. It's about when things go wrong, as in depression or anxiety. It's about happiness. It's about everything that matters to us. Psychology is a huge field, and it breaks up into different subfields. Some psychologists study the brain. They study neuroscience, the question of how this physical lump of flesh we have gives rise to our mental life. Other psychologists, like me, are developmental psychologists. We study how babies turn into children and how children turn into adults. How does a baby or child think differently from an adult? How much of it's hardwired? How much do we have to learn? Some psychologists study social psychology, which concerns the relationship of people with other people, as with regard to questions like prejudice or persuasion. Others are cognitive psychologists. A cognitive psychologist treats the brain like a complicated computer and asks questions like, how do we solve computational problems like understanding language or recognizing faces or remembering facts? Some psychologists approach this from an evolutionary perspective, looking at the question of how the mind evolved and how the evolutionary origins of the mind give us insight into how we think in the here and now. Many people, when they think of psychology, they think of clinical psychology. They think of Dr. Phil and Freud and people who are involved with mental illness. And a lot of psychologists do study this. One huge and important field of psychology involves exploring the diagnosis and the causes, and particularly the treatment of mental illnesses. Illnesses like schizophrenia, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorders, phobias, and so many other things. I'm going to talk about 3 separate case studies. I'm going to talk about compassion, racism, and sex. And I'm going to use these case studies as a way to introduce you to psychology. The first case study is compassion. What I mean by compassion is concern for other people. This is particularly interesting to me. This is my own research program. In my own laboratory at Yale, we look at the emergence of morality in babies and young children, and we particularly focus on the emergence of compassion. At what point in development do babies care about others? At what point in development does feelings of empathy and sympathy, sometimes anger, guilt, other moral emotions, how do they arise? To what extent are they built in? To what extent do they have to be learned? As a starting point, I have here a picture of a baby, and inside the baby's head is the baby's brain. The baby's brain is an extraordinary computing machine. There are, by some estimates, 100 billion neurons in the baby's brain. Now, neurons are basic cells that process and transmit information. And by one estimate, there's about 1.8 million connections between neurons that created per second. To give you a feeling of the complexity of the baby's brain, I'll use an analogy from Jeff Hawkins. Imagine a football stadium. Fill it up with cooked spaghetti. Then shrink it to the size of a soccer ball. Then make it much, much, much denser. And then you'll have some understanding of how much is going on inside a brain, inside even a baby's brain. Now, that much we know for sure. But where the real debate goes on concerns the nature of that computational structure. There's one view that is held by many philosophers and many psychologists, which is that the brain starts off as a blank slate, what the philosopher John Locke called a tabula rasa. And what goes on in development, the point of all those connections per second, is learning, is sucking up information from the environment. The baby starts off knowing nothing and turns into an adult by virtue of absorbing information at a tremendously powerful rate. Many philosophers and many psychologists, including me and my colleagues, are more enamored of another view. We don't deny that learning takes place, but we would argue in addition to that, there is an extraordinary early understanding, early specialization. The brain could better be understood in terms of what the psychologists Lida Cosmides and John Tooby described as a Swiss Army knife. It has many different parts, and each part is specialized for a different function. So much of the action in psychology has been a running debate over which view is right. And this concerns morality, both moral judgments of right and wrong, but also moral feelings, including compassion. Many people would argue that in that regard, the baby starts off with nothing. The idea is children start off immoral, monsters, or if not monsters, at least they know not for good and evil. This is not the view which I think is supported by the data. I think there's now more and more data in support of a different view of compassion. One way to make a baby cry is to expose it to the cries of other babies. There's sort of a contagiousness to the crying. It's not just crying. We also know that if a baby sees another human in silent pain, it will distress the baby. It seems part of our very nature to suffer at the suffering of others. We know that young babies, as they become capable of moving voluntarily, will share. They will share food, for instance, with their siblings and with kids that they're around. They will soothe. If they see somebody else in pain, even the youngest of toddlers will try to reach out and pat the person, maybe hand over a toy. There's some lovely studies finding that slightly older children are able to help others. When they see somebody who's unable to fulfill a goal, they'll seek out to come to their aid. So one elegant demonstration of this comes from a recent set of experiments where they take a toddler, put him or her in a situation where an adult is in some sort of mild distress, and see if the toddler will voluntarily help, even without any prompting. And they find that toddlers typically do. There seems to be some sort of impulse in us that's altruistic, that's kind, that's compassionate. In all of these cases, however, the kindness we see seems to apply to people who are close to us, who are either physically in our proximity, or who are our siblings, or our parents, or our friends. So the question arises, how broad does this compassion extend? Now, some people would argue that we start off with a very broad compassion. We would extend it to all individuals, to all people. But there's evidence supporting a somewhat different view, which is there's a moral instinct in us, there's a moral sense in us, but it's initially very narrow. It's only triggered by those close to us. In fact, our natural default feelings towards a stranger, far from being compassionate, is actually some sort of mixture of fear and hatred. We see this in all sorts of different ways. So with young children, we see it in what's called stranger anxiety. At around 9 months of age, babies start becoming panicked at the presence of strangers. And it seems to capture a universal part of development where the other is somehow thought of as dangerous. This sort of stranger anxiety fades in some cultures. If you were to find yourself in an airport in a new city, you're not likely to have a panic attack because you're surrounded by people you don't know. But in small-scale human societies, it might never go away. In a situation when an individual is raised with a few hundred other individuals around them, that is their circle of compassion, and their response to others is not positive. This is an observation that's been made by many anthropologists who study small-scale societies. So for instance, the anthropologist Jared Diamond, talking about small-scale societies in Papua New Guinea, writes, "To venture out of one's territory to meet other humans, even if they lived only a few miles away, was equivalent to suicide." Many years before, Margaret Mead was talking about the lifestyles of what were called at the time primitive cultures. And she is famously a supporter of these lifestyles. She argues that the Western world would be much better if we were to adopt the customs and thoughts and ideas, particularly with regard to sexuality, of these other societies. But she was very honest and very blunt about how members of these societies treat strangers. She writes, "Most primitive tribes feel that if you run across one of those subhumans from a rival group in the forest, the most appropriate thing to do is bludgeon them to death." I've talked about fear and hatred, but there's a third sort of response that we often get to strangers. This is disgust. Disgust is what Paul Rozin described as the body-soul emotion. It's a human universal. Humans everywhere are disgusted by certain things. We are disgusted by feces, urine, blood, vomit, rotten flesh, and most meat. Disgust has a characteristic facial response.
Ew!
And it seems to be part of our nature. Now, if it was limited to food and cockroaches and that sort of thing, it wouldn't have anything to do with my talk on compassion. But what's most interesting is that we're often disgusted by other people. Particularly, we're often disgusted by strange people. By definition, any category of human individuals is something you either belong to or you don't. It's either what psychologists call an in-group or an out-group. And we have laboratory research that explores the relationship between feelings of disgust and feelings towards outgroups. So we know, for instance, that people differ in how easily disgusted they are. You do a survey of people. You ask them questions like, how badly would this bother you? So one of the questions might be, you have to pick up a dead cat with your hands. There are some people who say, well, whatever. Some people go, oh my God, I'd rather die. Or you sit on a city bus seat and it's warm from the last person who was on it. And some people crack up. Why would that bother me? Some other people say, that's very disturbing. People differ in how sensitive they are to disgust. It turns out that where you stand with regard to disgust correlates with your feelings about outgroups. It correlates with your feelings about immigrants. It correlates with your feelings about sexual minorities, in particular, male homosexuals. The more easily disgusted you are, the more aversion you find to these others. We also know this experimentally. We know that, that by making people be disgusted, we can make them meaner. I'll give you an example of this. This is from a study I was involved with David Pizarro at Cornell University as the lead investigator. What we did was we brought people into a lab at Cornell and we asked them all sorts of questions regarding their feelings towards different groups and different policies. What do you think of African Americans? What do you think of gay men? What do you think of welfare? What do you think of immigration? So on and so forth. Half the people just filled it out and went home. The other half of the subjects went into the room, got the same survey. But the difference was, before they entered the room, we sprayed the room with a fart spray. It's the first experiment I've ever been involved with that used a fart spray. People would be kind of grossed out, and it would make them meaner. Not towards everything, but to make them particularly meaner towards outgroups, like male homosexuals. And this supports the idea that there's a connection in our minds between the visceral emotion of disgust and our feelings towards others. So what I've argued is we do have a natural compassion, but it's limited. It does not naturally extend to others. But that raises a puzzle, because you and me and everyone else we know can extend our compassion to strangers. To put it in the language that the philosopher Peter Singer has used, our moral circle has expanded. It might be that our ancestors, it might be that people in small-scale societies only cared about their family and friends. But we have a broader circle of compassion. We care about people in other countries. We care about people from other races. We care about people we've never seen before and we never will see. When some sort of disaster strikes, like a tsunami or a hurricane, many of us give our resources, even our blood, to help out people we've never met before. And that poses a neat psychological puzzle. What forces take our narrow moral circle, our narrow scope of compassion, and expand it to care for these others? Now, I think there's a lot of different answers to that question. Robert Wright, for instance, has argued that one force in expanding the moral circle has been human interconnections in commerce, in international travel, and so on. The more people you know, the more people you have contact with, the more we are interconnected in the world, the more you might care about them in a sort of self-interested altruism, where you care about them because their fates are intertwined with yours. And I think that there's a lot of value in that insight. But I want to focus on a more psychological, more individual-based mechanism for expanding the moral circle, a mechanism that happens to individuals as they get older, a part of development, which is their sympathies expand because of a certain sort of persuasion. I want to suggest that there's psychological evidence that supports the idea that we can expand our compassion, our moral circle, to faraway strangers by being made to think of them as if they're individual people. We think of them as if they're our friends and family. We think of them as if they're right in front of us. Joseph Stalin famously said, "A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic." And Mother Teresa presented a similar sentiment when she said, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at the one, I will." Psychologists like Paul Slovic have explored this in the lab. So for instance, they would do a study where they would have an appeal for a charity. And in fact, they would take the money they got and send it to the charity. And they would, for one group of subjects, describe the problem in terms of statistics, in terms of numbers, in terms of the millions of people suffering, the sort of suffering, the proportion of the population who is in desperate need. And they found that people would give, say, roughly $1. For the other group, they didn't bother with statistics at all. They didn't bother trying to impress them with the huge number of people suffering. They told them a story about a single individual. They had a picture of that individual. They gave her a name. And when you do that, you find that people are far more generous. It's far more powerful effect on their compassion. They will give roughly twice as much. Charities, when they try to appeal for people's help, won't throw numbers at you. They typically won't, because they know that doesn't work. The way to extend people's compassion, the way to motivate altruistic action, is to appeal to some very natural, very hardwired systems within us that respond to individual people. I think it's a tremendously persuasive way for a charity to work. And I think more generally, it's part of the story for how our compassion can get bigger and bigger. People talk about moral progress. People have argued that through our history, our moral circles have been expanding. We now live in a world where people believe we have moral obligations to other races, other nationalities, that sexism and racism are immoral. Consider the end of slavery in the United States. There are a lot of different factors that led to the end of slavery, but many historians would argue that one of the forces that led many white Americans to believe slavery was wrong was persuasion. In particular, it was the work of the author Harriet Beecher Stowe in her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. In this book, she didn't make logical arguments, she didn't make theological points or philosophical proposals. Rather, she got her readers to extend their sympathies. And this had a profound effect. It had a profound effect persuading them that slavery was wrong. So part of morality, part of right and wrong, is intimately connected with compassion, with our feelings towards others. Some scholars, like David Hume, argue that a sense of empathy, a sense of compassion, is absolutely central to becoming a fully moral being. And certainly notions of right and wrong come up in the domain of race. Because the very question of forming stereotypes and forming attitudes towards human groups is morally fraught. The second case study I want to talk about is racism. And I want to begin by making a connection to a branch of cognitive psychology. In particular, the branch of cognitive psychology that deals with how we make sense of the world, how we naturally form categories of the things we see and the things we interact with. Cognitive psychologists have pointed out that in order to survive in the world, we have to make generalizations. You've probably never seen those 3 pictures I have up here, but you immediately know that one is a dog, and one is an apple, and one is a chair. You will also have intuitions about these things. You'll make generalizations. You'll believe the dog can bark. The apple is something you can eat. A chair is something you could sit on. Now, you probably also realize that there are exceptions to this. Some dogs are silent, some apples are poisonous, some chairs will collapse if you sit on them. But still, if you couldn't make those generalizations, if you didn't recognize that some properties tend to co-occur with some objects, you would be helpless in the world. You wouldn't know what to eat. You wouldn't know how anything would react. You wouldn't survive. Part of being a successful human, in fact, part of being any successful animal, is being able to learn. And a good part of what learning is to make statistical generalizations on the basis of limited experience. You eat 1,000 apples, They all taste pretty good. You conclude, I can eat apples. Apples taste good. And when you're hungry, you reach for the apple. This is adaptive, it is rational, it is reasonable. But now there's a twist. The twist is that some of the categories that we form are categories of people. We form categories on the basis of sex, of age, of race, profession, religion, sexual orientation, nationality, and where the person lives. When we form categories of people, we often call these stereotypes. Now, stereotype may sound like a bad word, but there's nothing bad about it. For one thing, stereotypes are often accurate. We're reasonably good statistical learners, and so we tend to be reasonably accurate. Also, stereotypes are often positive, particularly about groups that we ourselves belong to. Some of the statistical generalizations may be correct and may be positive. Some groups have reputations for being smart, for being loyal, for being brave, for all sorts of things that are not at all negative. And so there's nothing inherently wrong about stereotypes. On the other hand, there are several problems with stereotypes. For one thing, they're reliable insofar as they're based on a sample, an unbiased sample of the population. But a lot of the information we get about human groups is through biased sources, like how they're represented in the media. And if these sources don't give you an accurate rendition, your stereotype won't be accurate. For example, many Italian Americans were upset at the depiction of Italian Americans in a television show, The Sopranos. This is because if you're in an area where the only Italian Americans you meet are those you see on TV and those you see on The Sopranos, you're going to think they're all mobsters. Many Jews historically have been troubled by Shakespeare's depiction of Shylock. If the only Jew you know is Shakespeare's Shylock, again, it's going to be a very bad impression. And so one problem with stereotypes is, while we have accurate statistical mechanisms for taking in information and drawing conclusions from them, often our information isn't reliable, and often this could lead to the formation of stereotypes that aren't right. A second problem is that stereotypes, regardless of whether or not they're accurate, can have a negative effect on the people that they apply to. And this is what the psychologist Claude Steele described as stereotype threat. So he has a vivid example of this. Here's how to make African Americans do worse on a math test. You have the test, and you put on the test that they have to identify their race. The very act of acknowledging that they're African American when given a test ignites in them thoughts of their own stereotype, which isn't positive, which is negative regarding academics, and that makes them do worse. Want to know how to make a woman do worse in a math test? Same thing. Get her to write down her sex. One recent study found a sort of clever twist on this. The study involved testing Asian American women. Turns out when Asian American women are given a test and they're asked to mark down their race, they do better than they would otherwise do. They're reminded of the stereotype, but it's a positive stereotype, and it bumps them up. You ask them, on the other hand, to mark down their sex, they do worse because they're women, and there's a negative stereotype towards women. That's an example of how stereotypes have a potentially damaging effect on people. A third problem with stereotypes is, in some way, our stereotypes of human groups are like our categories of dogs and apples and chairs. But there's a way in which they aren't. We're not dogs and apples and chairs, but we are members of human groups. And this fact of how you connect with the category has an effect on how you think of the category. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that when you're a member of the category, you boost it. You give it higher qualities. People in your group are smarter, they're nicer, they're more deserving, and so on. On the other hand, if it's an outgroup, if it's another category, particularly if it's a category that you're in some way competing against, the category gets denigrated. We see some vivid historical examples of this. In one study in 1942, Americans were asked to describe the top 2 features of Russians. And they described them as brave and hardworking. In 1948, they were asked the same question. They described them as cruel and conceited. The Russians didn't change. What changed was our relationship to them. Over the intervening years, they went from being part of a group that we were part of to the outgroup. The final problem with stereotypes is a moral one. Even if stereotypes are perfectly accurate, even if there are accurate summaries of the statistics of a group, there are many cases where we believe it's morally wrong to judge somebody based on their group membership. We should judge them as individuals. For all of these reasons, and maybe mostly for the last one, there's an interesting tension in how we think about other groups. On the one hand, we want to be consciously egalitarian, consciously non-racist, consciously thinking of individuals as individuals and not letting stereotypes, particularly ugly stereotypes, affect our judgments. And there's some evidence that we succeed at this. You look at the statistics, for instance, what you see in this graph is a proportion of Americans who say they would vote for a qualified African American to be president. And what you could see is, at a certain point by the mid-90s, just about everybody says that they would. And the election of Barack Obama shows that this wasn't just people lying when asked questions. It really reflects an honest-to-God, consciously egalitarian viewpoint. On the other hand, we also have an unconscious system. And the unconscious system is more statistics-driven, more biased, and less sensitive to moral concerns. So you get a tension between the conscious egalitarian system and the unconscious system, which is often driven by bias. This unconscious system is data-driven, and it is a lot less sensitive to our moral concerns than the conscious system. One striking example of unconscious biases involves being shown these two faces and asked, who's more American? Well, at some level, this is a ridiculous question. People would laugh when they'd hear it. Barack Obama's more American because he's like American. Tony Blair is British. But unconsciously, you can ask the same question. You could see how quickly it takes to associate these faces with words like American or not American. And it turns out, based on this sort of implicit unconscious test, people are often more willing and quicker to associate the face of Tony Blair as American than the face of Barack Obama. Of course, because Tony Blair has a white face and Barack Obama has a dark face. Now, one response to these sorts of studies, one perfectly legitimate response, I think, is say, who cares? Consciously, we're egalitarian. Consciously, we're non-prejudiced. We have these weird, quirky, unconscious biases that drive our behavior when pressing buttons and responding very fast. What difference does it make? But there's evidence it does make a difference. There's evidence that these unconscious biases play a role in things that matter very much in the real world. So consider some studies by Jack Dovidio and his colleagues. They first did this study in 1989, and what it involved is you give people resumes of candidates, and these resumes have pictures. And what the subjects in the experiment don't know is they were always given the same resume, but half of them got it with a white person, half of them a black person. And then they were asked, how strongly would you recommend this person for a job? Now, if these candidates had strong qualifications, they'd both be recommended. In fact, perhaps the black one is a bit more likely to be recommended than the white one. But when they had moderate qualifications, when it's a judgment call, the white candidate was statistically more likely to be recommended for the job than the black candidate. Not because these people said, I'm a racist, I'm going to do it this way, but rather because they're swayed by this factor that they may not have been conscious of. As I said, this was done in 1989, but they did the same study in 1999 and got the same result, and they did the same study in 2005 and got the same result. So we're at war with ourselves. We have, on the one hand, these conscious beliefs about how we think we should think, how we think we should behave. On the other hand, we have this unconscious system that makes all these sort of decisions and affects us in ways that we might not know about, we may not be aware of. The good news is we're also smart. And part of being smart means that we can structure our world so that we can make it that the unconscious biases matter less. To give you an example, I'll turn not to race, but to gender. Not too long ago, women were deeply underrepresented in symphony orchestras. And the reason for this, it was argued, is because they don't play as well. In a fair and biased fashion, they've been judged, and they just don't sound as good. But in part based on these sort of discoveries, symphony orchestras began to hold blind auditions. What they would do is they would have the person play behind a screen. The judges won't know whether they're listening to a man or to a woman. Once this was put into place, the representation of women in symphony orchestras shot up. It wasn't that originally these were just sexists who say, I don't like women, I'm going to count against them. Rather, these were perhaps good, non-sexist people who couldn't help hearing the woman differently from the man. And I like this example because it shows how, first, social psychology and psychology in general can shape policy in a good way, but more generally, it shows how we're smart enough to manipulate the world so that our better selves get to make the decisions. The third case study I want to talk about is sex. And when it comes to sex, considerations of evolution become incredibly relevant. I think the question of how we evolved and the question of how our minds are now shaped in response to evolutionary pressure is something that pertains to all of psychology. It pertains to certainly for how we think about human groups, certainly for compassion and morality, and all sorts of other topics I haven't discussed, like perception and language and memory. But it's screamingly obvious in the domain of sex. As soon as you start thinking about our bodies and our brains, you're faced with a puzzle, and it's the sort of puzzle that can only be resolved in terms of evolution. And here's what the puzzle is. What's the difference between males and females? Well, there's a general answer to this that doesn't pertain to any particular species, that goes across every creature on Earth. The males are the ones with the small sex cells. To be a male is to have a sperm, which contains genetic material, and that's basically it. The females have the large sex cell. The female sex cell, the egg, also contains genetic material, but it contains a cover, it contains food, it contains all the apparatus needed to get an organism growing. So here's the puzzle. You look around most animals, not all animals, but most animals, and the male is bigger and more aggressive. So why would the animal with the smaller sex cell tend to grow up to be the bigger animal? And this has been a mystery for a very long time until an evolutionary biologist named Robert Trivers solved it. And he solved it by making reference to the idea of parental investment. Trivers defines parental investment as any investment by the parent in an individual offspring that increases the offspring's chance of surviving at the cost of the parent's ability to invest in other offspring. Given the different size of the sex cells, it means that males typically have less investment than females, because in most, though not all species, the offspring grows inside the female's body. And while that offspring is growing inside the female's body, the male is free to have other offspring, but the female is not. For humans, for instance, a man can ejaculate and then moments later or hours later or however much later can ejaculate again, and there's virtually no practical limit to how many different offspring a man can have. For a woman, when she gets pregnant, she can't have more kids during that period. And in fact, it's difficult for her to have kids even later on when she's breastfeeding. So there's a fairly small number of offspring a female human can have. This makes a difference. It makes a difference in the sort of economic, game theoretic structure of human sexuality. What follows from this, from an economic point of view, is that males compete with one another for access to females. Both males and females want offspring. That's the genetic imperative. But males can be more into number, while females can be more into quality. This leads to competition between males, and the competition is of two different sorts. There's competition male against male, which leads to the evolution of aggressive traits. It even leads to the evolution of some species of special organs, like the giant horns of some animals, that exists for males and not females because they evolved according to this reproductive logic based on a lower parental investment. It also leads males to evolve certain traits to attract the attention of females. Females are the scarce resource here. Females are, as a rule, more choosy when it comes to short-term sexual partners than males. And so males compete with one another to attract females. The most striking biological example of this is the elaborate, glorious plumage of the peacock. There's a cartoon I enjoy here because the peahens are saying to the peacock, "Cut the crap and show us your willy," which I like because it sounds sort of British, but I also like because it nicely captures the evolutionary logic behind what all of this is for. Finally, you get to relative choosiness. Females are, as a rule, more choosy when it comes to short-term sexual partners than males. And this shows up in a couple of ways. It shows up in prostitution. So prostitution is a huge industry in the world. And with very few exceptions, prostitutes cater to male customers. Then there's pornography. Now, pornography may appeal to different sexes. Some people have argued that romance novels are sort of the equivalent to pornography for women. But what appeals to men is often sort of images of sexually receptive women. This isn't the same as sort of a one-night stand, but it's a psychologically vicarious one-night stand where this image is enough to lead to arousal. The only thing interesting I have to say about this is a recent study that suggests this is not an exclusively human vice. So a recent study involved showing pornography to rhesus macaques. The question was, would these monkeys pay to see porn? And so you didn't have a financial system for these monkeys, so they set up a nice apparatus where at a certain point the monkey had a choice. Could either stare at a picture or turn and sip sweet orange juice. Monkeys love orange juice. So the question is, what sort of pictures would they give up on this orange juice in order to see? And there were two sorts of pictures that they would pay to see. They would pay to see the behinds of female rhesus monkeys, and they would pay to see the faces of high-status male rhesus monkeys. Sort of like the equivalent of Playboy magazine and People magazine, suggesting that two of the major human vices, pornography and celebrity worship, are in fact not uniquely human. Now, you can go on about the differences between males and females in terms of sexual interest and sexual cues and so on. But I want to focus for the rest of this case study on certain things we have in common. One thing we have in common is an attraction to what we would call beauty. Certain things are beautiful, certain things appeal to us universally. Some studies find that in the first tenth of a second after looking at a face, you have computed how beautiful it is. Cultures differ tremendously, different times, different places, in what counts as beautiful, what counts as sexually attractive, and that is entirely true. There are interesting and powerful differences. But at the same time, there are also universals. There are certain things that people everywhere find attractive. And we can use evolutionary theory to make sense of the sort of things that people find as beautiful. So, to some extent, beauty equates to cues to youth. Cues like round eyes, full lips, smooth, tight skin, most likely because they're cues that the person is young, is able to have kids, has many years ahead of them, and so on. Beauty also equates to health. We are drawn to features like absence of deformities, clear eyes, unblemished skin, intact teeth, and average faces. And you might think, average faces? That's a strange thing to put in beautiful, as a category of beautiful. But it turns out average faces actually look really good. So what an average face does is it gets rid of all of the things that are unusual, and people tend to find it quite attractive. Now, one accusation that always comes up in these situations is, who did you get this data from? And in fact, psychologists are often guilty of collecting data from 24 university freshmen and then saying that these conclusions apply to all of humanity. But not in this case. In this case, studies of human attractiveness have been done cross-culturally, and you get pretty much the same findings wherever you go. Again, there are some interesting differences, but these universals seem to always be attractive. The work that's most exciting to me along these lines is actually done with babies. So adults can rank faces as attractive and unattractive, but you can also see what babies think about faces. And it turns out using babies' looking time as a measure for what they like to see, so how long will they look at a face, it turns out that babies' preferences for attractive faces match pretty well adults' preferences for attractive faces. So for instance, in some wonderful work by Langlois and her colleagues, she would show different degrees of averageness across faces, composites of more and more people. These faces are not the faces of real people. These faces are computer composites of multiple people, and they are not bad looking. But you can get better than average for both males and females. For females, many people will judge a face better than average if it's feminized. If you take the features that define a face as female and you exaggerate them, as in the picture on the right, it tends to look a little bit better than your average female face. For men, you could do the same thing. You can take faces and take your average male face and turn it into testosterone man, which is the face that you're looking at on the left. It turns out that women's responses to testosterone man differ according to whether or not they're ovulating. So if a woman is ovulating, she's more likely to find this manliest of man face attractive. While if not, she tends to go back to just find the average man more attractive. And there's different theories of precisely why this is so. It does suggest that our sexual psychologies connect with our reproductive preferences in all sorts of interesting ways. But there's a lot more to looking good than how you look. It turns out that how attractive you find a face is critically dependent on how much you like the person. The more you like somebody, the better they look to you. This is why spouses in happy marriages will honestly find their husband or wife far more attractive than anyone else finds them. And this is true more generally. In a classic study, David Buss tested people from 37 different cultures around the world and asked, who is your perfect mate? He was largely looking for sex differences in these studies, and he found them. He found all sorts of differences in what men were looking for and what women were looking for. But he also found one similarity, one way in which men and women were alike. And this is that for both, the number one quality people were looking for in a mate was kindness. All of this in the domain of sex supports a moral from Shakespeare, which is, love looks not with the eyes, but with the mind. What I've done is I very briefly talked about 3 case studies in the domain of psychology. I talked about compassion, I talked about racism, and I've talked about sex. In the course of this, I've tried to illustrate certain themes in the study of psychology in general. And in fact, I started by listing 6 domains of psychology. Neuroscience, I started by talking about the baby's brain and gave that as a starting point for the question of the development of compassion, development of these other traits. But every domain of psychology, every aspect of our mental life is caused by our physical brains. And in fact, in all of these domains I've talked about, compassion and moral psychology more general, race and stereotyping and thinking about groups, and sex and sexuality, people have used the methods of neuroscience to better understand how the mind works in these domains. I've talked about development, and I focused mostly in development on the first case study of compassion. But of course, there's a huge amount of very interesting research on the development of our understanding of groups, asking the question, for instance, are young children racist? Do young children have implicit biases? And of course, in the development of romance and sexuality. How does the mind of a child before puberty differ, and how much is it like the mind of an adult after puberty? And how do these differences take place? These are extraordinarily interesting developmental questions. All 3 domains connect to social psychology and cognitive psychology in clear ways. They're all questions about social psychology. They're all questions about dealing with other people, how we deal with and make sense of other people. And they all connect to questions of cognitive psychology, like the perception of faces, the formation of categories, the comprehension of stories. Those are all central parts of cognitive psychology and central to understanding the domains we've talked about here. We've talked about evolution, particularly, again, in the case of sexuality. But of course, the evolutionary psychology of morality and compassion is a fascinating issue, connecting with research done with other primates, our evolutionary relatives like chimpanzees and monkeys. I've said the least about clinical psychology. Clinical psychology is extraordinarily interesting and also connects to each of the domains that I've talked about. People are interested in the psychopathology related to sexuality. They're particularly interested in the psychopathology, in mental illness, in the domain of morality. Because this connects to one of the most troubling and one of the most interesting questions in clinical psychology, which concerns the psychopath. There are some of us, apparently, who don't have consciences, who don't feel compassion, who will destroy other people's lives out of malice or self-interest or simple boredom. And the question of where psychopaths come from, what's the precise nature of what's going wrong with them, and most of all, what could be done about them, are issues of extraordinary interest. Psychology is the perfect liberal arts major because it connects across all these interesting disciplines and gives you intellectual tools that we share with philosophers and we share with chemists and we share with people who study English literature. It brings them all together in a project of studying the mind. Every interesting question in psychology is also an interesting question for scholars outside psychology. We have made huge progress over the last many years in understanding mental life. And I think there's no reason to expect this progress to stop. I think that in the end, the most important and intimate aspects of ourselves, how we understand other people, our emotions, our motivations, our desires, our sense of right and wrong, can be understood through the methods of scientific psychology, through constructing and testing hypotheses, through bringing to bear considerations based on evolution and computation and neuroscience. Now, some people might find this a scary prospect. I know that there are some people who worry that a scientific perspective of the mind takes away from us somehow. It diminishes us. It makes us less than what we are. I don't agree. I have the opposite reaction, which is that the more you understand the mind from a serious scientific point of view, the more you come to appreciate its complexity, its uniqueness, and its beauty. Thank you.